empty lives and try to help people to better understand what's going on when we experience those disruptive changes, the grief and loss that can accompany those, and then to promote honest hope and resiliency. And that's part of what we will be doing today. So I invite you to think about your own self as we get started in terms of your care, even for this hour and a half. Are you close to some losses and grief at this moment? And if so, just assess your own readiness to be part of the discussion, but also think about who's available to you when the session is over, if you need to lean on someone or to offload or just to share some of what has been bubbled up. My email is here on this first slide, and Lisa has that. And as she said, you'll also get the material. So let's jump in. This is some wisdom from the 13th century. I don't think there's anyone in the session today quite that old, but this lovely poem from Rumi, a Middle Eastern poet, and he uses a fascinating metaphor. This being human is a guest house, and every morning a new arrival. And then I love it that it has an arc of life, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor to our homes. So our being human is a guest house, and joy, depression, meanness comes as unexpected visitor. The reason I put this at the front is the line after that, which was counterculture in the 13th century and is still even in the 21st century. Welcome and entertain them all. Not welcome in the sense of spin or rose-colored glasses, not look on the bright side, those kinds of issues. Or killing old. But rather get a second opinion, assess was this a nightmare? Is this for real the next day? What kind of assessment needs to be done, but how do I welcome it? Let me give you a couple of stories that makes this more real, and I'm going to use stories throughout. A grandfather had died, and the 6-year-old grandson came over to his granny's house a few days after the funeral, and as children can do so well, turned to his grandmother and says, "Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa? Or do you never want to talk about Grandpa?" How's that for a question? It's a lovely question. And she was aware this was a threshold even for this boy. And she says, "Well, there are times when I need to talk about him very much, when it really helps me. But there are other times when I feel that I can't, either because it hurts too much or because it feels private at that particular moment. But on the whole, I want to talk." The granny was giving this boy a welcome, that whatever you want to talk about, we can talk about, and that she was open to doing both. Because lots of families, lots of people have a kind of no talk rule or don't talk about tough stuff. And the granny was saying to this boy, we can do that. And he said, "So it's all right to do what you feel like, right?" She wasn't sure she wanted to say yes or no quite explicitly, but she says yes. And the boy says, "Let's talk about him. I'm ready." And so it's that kind of readiness. Here's one more that may be common for some of you. This is between a mother and a daughter, as the mother is getting closer to the end of her life. "You still don't understand, do you?" Mother said to me. "It doesn't matter how much time I have left. All I have is now. I wish you all could accept that and let go of your projections. Just let me live so that I can die." She's expressing the hospice rule from around the world. Live as fully as you can for as long as you can. So it's that I want us to think about today as we think about the conversation between our brain and our body, our heart, our gut, as what are we willing to welcome? So another way of putting this is that change is a time when predictability breaks down. Predictable ways of doing things are interrupted by change. That's what I mean by disruption. And it can be a positive change as well as a one that's a bit off-putting, but it results in uncertainty. What do we do now? How do we behave with this? Again, a story that you may know from Stephen Covey. He describes a scene in a New York subway where on a Sunday morning, people are sitting quietly reading newspapers, lost in thought, and then suddenly a man and his children entered the car and began to be so loud and rambunctious that the whole climate changed. The man sat down next to me. He says, apparently oblivious to the situation. The children were yelling back and forth, throwing things, very disturbing. And Covey says it was difficult not to feel irritated. So he finally, as compassionately as he could, he said, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more. Would you be willing to say that in a public place?" And then here's the issue around change. The man lifted his gaze as if to come to the consciousness of the situation for the first time and said softly, "Oh gosh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess I don't know how to handle it either. I don't know what to think, and I guess I don't know how to handle it either." There's the uncertainty. But here's the issue also for you in terms of the series on brain development and brain use, brain health. Covey uses this to describe what he calls a change in terms of orientation. Suddenly, I saw things differently. Because I saw differently, I thought differently, I felt differently, I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. Everything changed in an instant. It's what he calls a paradigm shift. So, how do we move to, when dealing with uncertainty, to embrace it with a paradigm shift? So let's get some definitions. If you ask people to free associate on the words grief and loss, they're all typical. About 65% will say something about death and dying. That's the association lots of people have. But look at this definition. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. In the discussion and with the stories, you'll hear a variety of losses: dignity, safety, speech, mobility, a spouse, a home. Just think of all the losses that are parts of our lives. It's much more than death. We may lose, yes, with a death, our historian. The local library closes because the grandpa or grandma were the historians, that kind of thing. And so it's all of these losses that we need to embrace and not just around death. And then here comes the particular dialogue today that grief, the natural response, both voluntarily and involuntarily to losses, is to grieve it. And it's a whole body response. And so it can be emotional. That's the sadness, the tears, the rage, the anger. But it's also cognitive. How fast was he driving? Do we have enough insurance? Can you still do a funeral during the pandemic? How do we do this? All those informational questions. It's a spiritual response to loss. What kind of world? What kind of God? Does this make sense? Is it fair? And then it's a visceral response to loss, a physical response to loss. Why am I so tired? Why am I so tired? And so it's all of those things that are going on. Here's an example from a classic book about grief. You may know C.S. Lewis's The Grief Observed. He was at Oxford in England, a Don, they call them, a wise one. And then his wife died. And here is this issue around the intersection of our heart and head and body. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out not to be a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. And if I don't stop writing and talking about that history at some quite arbitrary point, there's no reason I should ever stop. There's something to be new, chronicled every day. Grief is a long valley, a line, and goes on and on. He's speaking emotionally. He's speaking cognitively. He's probably even speaking spiritually. And he's also giving reference to his own body and the changes that are there. So this is this intersection of when he's stressed, how do we begin to address it? So here's an image for our current time. It's what I call a four-legged stool. And at the top there, you see typical losses. And those often involve the intersection of all of our parts, because if there's a death of someone or a diagnosis with cancer or with Parkinson's or with dementia, a child with diabetes, those are typical losses. Doesn't mean they're easy because they're typical, but at least we have common response traditions called funerals, called retirement events, called rehabilitation. And so our heart and head can begin to address those typical losses because we may have some familiarity with them. And if we don't, some other people do in our circle, and we can draw on those. But some of those losses, those are what I would call conspicuous losses because there may be hair loss because of cancer. Someone may not be going to work because they've retired. There may be a funeral. And so there's a conspicuous quality to a number of those typical losses. But for some, there can be also what we call shattered dreams. It's the interruption of their future story, their plans, their presumed world gets shattered by those personal losses. Who am I now? I don't want to be a widow, and all of that goes with that. So those are ones that we know at a personal level. The bottom two are ones that have become a bit more conspicuous in our world in the last couple of years or so. Look at the state of the world. I began hearing in 2018. Yes, I've heard it much of my life, but it got much more common in the beginning in 2018, much more in 2019, and certainly over the last year or so. People would be doing their work in a caregiver group that I do, or a cancer support group, or a bereavement group, or a job loss group. They would be doing their work. And then they would turn to me and other group members often at the end and say, Ted, you know, if I wake in the middle of the night, I'm not thinking about my cancer. Or Ted, if I perseverate in the middle of the day, I'm not worried about my dead husband or about that situation. Ted, I'm scared about the state of the world. And when I would ask people, because these were different groups, people who didn't have any association with each other, some people would talk about the climate, wondering if the earth is going to be here for their great grandchildren. Some others would talk about immigration. Some people would talk about the have and have nots. Some people would talk about the political divisions, especially here in the United States, and the divisiveness of our current politics. And so people are both dealing with their personal disruptive changes, but also worried about the state of the world. And then more recently, especially over the last 16, 17 months, we've been dealing with COVID-19 and all of the ambiguity of that, because the first reaction, certainly even 16 months ago, 15 months ago, was not loss, because most of us had not lost anything at that time, but it was ambiguity and anxiety. Oh my gosh. And then they began to talk about wearing masks and that you can't go there. And schools were closed. And so all of the anxiety that went with that experience. So think about all of these things. And so here's my first question for you, though some of the earlier slides may have raised a question for you. How have or will these affect your life? And look at the list there of uncertainty, ambiguity at the bottom. Have you turned off the news? Do you need to? Are you listening to? And what channels are you listening to? Are there tension about choices even now? Things are opening up both in Wisconsin and in Minnesota, but can we go to that restaurant? Will there be concerts that we want and entertainment venues that we can go to? Can the family get together for a reunion this summer? And if so, where? All of those questions. Is there pandemic anxiety for you because you have a pre-existing condition? Or is someone in your circle a loved one and you're being a bit more guarded for them? My family has watched out for me because I'm the grandpa for many of them and they want to take care of grandpa. And so there's an anxiety because I'm the older one. And then there's what we might call the typical grief and loss. There's the community violence. We're here in Minnesota, or this weekend, experiencing the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death, and some would call it a murder by a police officer just a year ago this weekend. What about isolation fatigue? Lisa and I were talking about, and Angela as well, are we still giving elbow bumps to one another, or can we shake hands soon? Or give someone a hug if that's acceptable, and so on. So how do these affect you? And are you using your thoughtful process, your brain, the cognitive pieces, or are you operating more out of your gut, your heart? What informs the ways these affect you? How is your body doing? Are you experiencing what we're now called languishing? Are you just more tired, less energy? What's going on for you as you experience these things? So I'm asking you to be self-aware. Virginia Satir said years ago that the only instrument that we bring to our lives and to helping one another is ourselves. So the more self-aware that we are about our stuff, the more present we can be in the exchange with others. What's likely to compromise your ability to do self-care? What's likely to compromise your ability to be with another right now? Are you overloaded because of the pandemic that if a neighbor would say, do you have time for a cup of coffee? I just need to offload. Are you willing to do that? Or are you just overloaded yourself and need to gently say, thank you for asking. That's an honor to be asked, but I'm sorry, I'm just not in a good place to do that right now. Can you set that kind of boundary and that limit because of your own awareness? So I want you to think about your own awareness around these subject matters. So here's a list. It's a busy list, but look at it, scale up and down, because these are factors that can exacerbate losses, cause something that on the face of it might seem rather minor to get larger. And just let me comment about some of these. The loss or stress accumulation or overload. Accumulation is from the moment of your birth until this very hour. Overload is the last year or so, 3 months or so, 3 years or so. It's this recent period. Has there been too many things at once that creates an accumulation or overload? Here's a woman's story about how these losses begin to interact with one another. She calls it new grief. Rejoicing in having survived 2 years since being diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, she welcomed her garden's gifts of succulent tomatoes and squash and made further peace with what seemed like a century ago in that same garden, her son's suicide. So she's named 2 losses, her own ovarian cancer and a son's completed suicide. Then driving to church on the radio, she heard that they'd begun bombing in Israel and Gaza. Sobbing, unable to see through her tears, she pulled over and surrendered to a new grief at now losing her love of the world and the peace that she hoped to die in. That's loss overload and loss accumulation. Loss of control or power. Who's in charge now? Loss of normative rules. For a runner to die of a heart attack, allegedly quite healthy, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for children to die first. I had a 23-year-old grandson to die just in 2017. He was supposed to carry my casket, and I had to carry his. It breaks the normative rules. Losses which violate moral expectations, those are ones where it doesn't make sense, but is someone culpable? A drunken driver, someone who doesn't stop smoking, someone who puts themselves in harm's way, a completed suicide, as I said earlier. And then on down the list, those that stretch developmental abilities. Disenfranchised losses are losses where there's a kind of no talk rule. You're not allowed to talk about it, disenfranchised. And then some of the other subjects, ambiguous losses that we'll begin talking about now. So these are things that this can be the overload that can tax our brain as well as our emotions, because we are dealing with a number of things that cause something to get larger. So let's look for a moment at ambiguous losses. It's one of the ones that is the hardest to deal with, because ambiguous losses by definition are unclear, confusing, and for which future stories and outcomes are unknown. We're pulled in both ways. Here's an example that may be common for some of you. It's from Madeleine Ingles' book, The Summer of the Great Grandmother. Who is this cross old woman for whom I can do nothing right? I don't know her. She's not my mother, and I'm not her daughter. She won't eat anything we cook, so we resort to games. I do the cooking as usual, but someone must say, "Eat Allen soup, grandmother. You know you like Allen soup." And then she stands back from this confusing moment with her mother. I know this is a classic symptom of dementia, this turning against the persons that you love most. And this knowledge is secure above my eyebrows, but very shaky below. There's the heart and the gut and the head. Knowledge is secure above my eyebrows, but very shaky below. There's something in me that rejects and resents this reversal of roles. I want my mother to be my mother, and she's not evermore, not ever again. That's the ambiguity of these kinds of situations. Here's what's happened with the pandemic. Pauline Boss has written a lot about ambiguous loss, has to do with unanswered questions. And what she writes here about the pandemic could describe lots of situations. What's disturbing us is not just the virus, but the ambiguity surrounding it. What it will do, what we should do about it. Science provides some answers, but we're experiencing uncertainty, and that's very stressful for a society that's accustomed to solving problems and having definitive answers. So there's a brain health question for you. Are you a person who likes a list, likes clarity, wants a plan, and move through it? Well, what if you are a caregiver for someone who has a particular kind of condition that's ambiguous? And what do you do then? Because are you flexible? Can you go with more loosey-goosey? My mom moved further and further into the fog of Alzheimer's, and it took me a while to simply accept whatever mother would show up, because I wanted her to remember me, use my name. I wanted her to respond to some of my questions, to share some of the stories. And there were days when she could do that, but there are other days when she could not. So I had to begin to teach myself to be more accustomed to and to embrace the ambiguity that can occur. Another version of this for some that creates the ambiguity is what Colin Parks calls the loss of the assumed world. All of us from the moment of our birth have building inside ourselves a model of the world, a set of assumptions that we use to plan our behavior accordingly. And so we expect when we go to bed last night, the next day is going to be like the last one. We rely on the accuracy of these assumptions to maintain our orientation in the world, to control our lives. And then the haunting line at the bottom there, anything which challenges this model can incapacitate us. Here's an example of a mother. Autism knocked on my door in the middle of a life I thought was under my control. It swept through my house and cleared away all fantasies, pictures, and maps of the family I was supposed to have had. Autism knocked on my door in the middle of a life I thought was under my control. There's the assumed world. And I lost the family I was supposed to have had. Here's the way that Gay Becker talks about the same thing. When expectations about the course of life are not met, people experience inner chaos and disruption. Such disruptions represent a loss of the future story, our plans and our hopes. And that led to my work over the last 25 years about shattered dreams. So I've been doing this work for a number of years, and we would often gather in groups around conspicuous losses, a group dealing with multiple sclerosis, a caregiver group, a cancer support group, and we would ask people at the beginning to introduce themselves and their association with the medical condition or the bereavement. And so someone would say, "Hello, my name is Ted. I'm here because a grandson died in 2017." But in the midst of that, people would begin to say, not just the conspicuous loss, but say, "Never expected this. This wasn't part of the plan. Why don't they warn you? This is not fair." I thought they were still talking about the conspicuous loss until one day in a session, someone like you spoke up, not me, not a co-leader, and turned to someone who said, "I never expected this. This wasn't part of the plan," and said, "You know, it sounds like you had some pictures of your life, some pictures of the way your life was supposed to be, and life hasn't turned out to match the pictures. Sounds like you had some dreams, and those dreams are gone. Those dreams are abandoned." A Shattered Dream. Here's Jane Kenyon's poem about looking ahead, of anticipatory shattered dreams. I got out of bed on two strong legs, it might have been otherwise. Ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe flawless peach, it might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birch wood all morning, I did the work I love. Goes on through a typical day, and then the poem ends. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the wall and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. One day I know it will be otherwise. A Shattered Dream. So here's a slide of shattered dreams. If you have a member of your family, a child, an adult, or an elder who has some special needs, maybe your dream that this person be normal again. It may be the dream of how a home should be. Have you had to make some renovations, a ramp, uh, some other, put people all on the same floor, lock some things for safety because someone might go into a drawer where there are some drugs or some alcohol or whatever. The dream of time for self because now you have all these other caregivers in your life. The dream that the caregiver could withstand any stress or challenge. The dream of family, even family again, birth again. The dream of retirement. So those are what we mean by the shattered dreams that can occur that are part of the losses. It's not just the death, but these things of some of the losses that can occur. So here are questions again that we can use in the discussion period that might help you to assess, are you or someone else experiencing shattered dreams? When you pictured this time in your life, what did you picture? When you pictured being, and fill in your own age, 37, 57, 77, what did you picture? When you thought about being a grandparent, what did you picture? When you thought about being a widow or widower, what did you picture? If and when you thought about losses in your family, how did you think it would be? Tell me about the plans that you and someone else had and so on. What you want to listen for are there pictures inside that are in contrast to the way your life is. It's more than disappointment, it's a huge loss. And so we need to grieve shattered dreams in order to move forward in our life to face whatever is coming. So that's a lot to deal with. So I might even have exacerbated your stress, but how does stress show up for you? How do you know what's going on for you? And yes, it can be any of these three, but most of us have one of these that's more dominant than another. Does your stress show up more physically with hormonal or adrenaline surges or being kind of knocked, insomnia, chronic fatigue, headaches, muscle fatigue, digestive problems, shallow breathing? How does it affect you physically? Or is it for you more psychological, where you have increased moodiness, a bit of withdrawal from others? You're not just isolated because of the pandemic, but you're pulling back because of embarrassment or because you're experiencing the languishing, the overload. You have difficulty concentrating, making decisions. Is there memory loss, not because of dementia, but because you've got so much going on, trying to deal with the forest and the trees? Are you easily angered? Or is it more behavioral in terms of increased or decreased eating, using more drugs or alcohol, lack of motivation, absenteeism? It's not just a withdrawal from others, but you're really absenting yourself behaviorally, even if you're in the same household, just not talking as much, pulling back. Are there relationship problems? What's going on as you're experiencing these kinds of issues? What's happening for you? Here's an example from Kay Redfield Jamison, who has lived with bipolar conditions, manic depressive illness, much of her life, and so on. She's contrasting the difference between grief and depression. There were 1,000 things I remembered once David had died, and there were many, many regrets for lost opportunities, unnecessary, damaging arguments, a deepening realization that there was nothing that could be done to change what had happened. There's so many dreams lost. All of our plans for a house full of children were lost. Seemingly a lot was a loss for us, but grief, fortunately, is very different than depression. She knows about both of them. It's different from depression. Grief is sad, it is awful, but it is not without hope. David's death did not plunge me into unendurable darkness. Suicide never crossed my mind, and there was a very real solace in the offsetting and enormous kindness of friends and even strangers. So she's doing a bit of an assessment of how her stress shows up and is letting her body know that this is not a part of her illness. This is part of normal grieving. That's the discussion that we may want to have with one another. So another piece that I think I want us to be attentive to before we move to discussion just a bit is the words that we use. And lots of people don't use straightforward words to describe a medical or mental health condition, even a death. Some people can't say the D word, death. Some people can't say the C word, cancer. So they use what we call metaphors or euphemisms. But if something is unmentionable, it can also be unmanageable. Even if we can't say the word, how does it come out of our mouth? We may call all things by name out of the silence to again be with us. We must do that. Emily Dickinson said years ago that some people will say things in a slanted way, tell the truth, but tell it slant. That people sometimes are talking without speaking, hearing without listening. So, what are the words that we use? So, some people use metaphors. Richard Kopp said that we need to be attentive to metaphors. So, notice the metaphors. Invite yourself or someone else to explore it. If I were seeing it the way you would see it, what would I see? For example, lots of people after the death of a loved one talk about falling into a hole. I just fell off a cliff. I'm just in a dark hole, and so on. We need to notice those metaphors and follow those, and don't say, what do you mean? Rather, to follow the metaphor. So tell me about the hole. This is the way one man described his hole after his wife died. I miss her all the time. I know in my head that she has gone, and I still keep looking. The only difference is that I'm now getting used to the pain. It's like discovering a great hole in the ground. To begin with, you forget it's there, and you keep falling in. After a while, it's still there, but you learn to walk around it. So people use these metaphors to describe the grief that's part of their lives. So be fair to others, be fair to yourself. If there are words that you are reluctant to say, you don't want to say the word cancer or dementia, but how are you describing it? And so on. What are the ways that people describe it? A colleague and I put together a book of poems, all by Minnesota poets, in which they talked about loss and renewal. And look, even here are just some examples. Grief never leaves, only changes. It waits outside doors, keeps a place at the table. That grief hangs around. Disaster sucks all the air out of the room, swing shut doors in our brains' corridors. Not saying the word grief, but there it is, because it shuts the door. All I have is a broken voice, a heart immense with sorrow. And what I'm advocating, if someone begins to use this kind of language, that we follow them and tell me more about what you mean by a broken voice. Tell me about the disaster going on in your life. How does grief come from the outside to the inside of your house?
Ted, can I just interrupt for a quick second? You bring up such a good point about, when, bringing up the words, tell me more. I think that can really help somebody to be heard and understood. And that's really showing empathy versus sympathy, right?
Yes. And what you're doing, thank you for interrupting, Lisa, it's to meet the person where they are, not where we want them to be. Again, an example with my mom. I was with my mom when she was deep in the fog of her dementia. There's a metaphor, the fog of dementia. And I was in her room with her physically. This is a few years ago. And I got the impression that she was looking over my shoulder at something instead of looking me in the eye. And that's not like my mom because she was very present and often was even in the midst of her dementia. And I looked over my shoulder, and there was a calendar on the wall behind me. And on the calendar was what we might call a calendar dog. And I looked back at my mom, I looked over my shoulder, and I said, "Oh, there's that dog." And mom said, "That dog is looking at me. That dog is looking at me." And so I needed to follow the metaphor, not to say, "Hey, mom, there's no, that dog is not alive," that kind of comment. Rather say, "What's the dog saying? Does the dog's look friendly? Does it look like a friendly dog? Does that look like a dog that's scary? Should I move away? That dog is right behind me." So I'm following the metaphor, trying to have a conversation and trying to meet the person where they are. So yes, Lisa, your interruption is right on target, that we need to meet people where they are. When we do that, we aid people in something that is a life experience, begins in childhood, and something that we do throughout our lives, that we are constantly storying and restoring after losses. And it involves grieving the old story before creating the next, not necessarily new story. Here's an example of a little boy. My mom says I'm a sugar plum. My mom says I'm her lamb. My mom says I'm completely perfect just the way I am. My mom says I'm a wonderful, special, terrific little guy. My mom just had another baby. Why? I wonder how many firstborns are out there. Did you have a wish that this could go away? We had a neighbor down the street who came and knocked on our door. I opened the door and introduced myself to this child. He knew me, I knew him. And he said, "Would you like a baby?" And I thought he was talking about a gerbil or a hamster, maybe a cat or a dog. And he said, "My mom's pregnant and we don't need another one." He was already beginning to be aware that his story would be changing. He would have to share space with a sibling. He would have to probably share toys, and that this other person, once arrived, would probably take some of the attention. So when we story and restory, we listen for major components, themes, and values of the old story to see how they can be reframed into the new story. And so it's what some writers call relearning and reauthoring our lives. And I'm guessing each of you have done this in your own way, whether you called it this or not. Tom Attic calls it relearning your world. Shattered Dream, a world living with a pandemic, a world after a death. Narrative therapist Michael White began to hear in books he was reading, literary stories, the same things that he heard in his therapy practice. And he said effective therapy is about engaging people in the reauthoring of the compelling plights of their lives. Who am I now? Do we need to have what you might even call a coming out party after a death, after a diagnosis, after a job change, after retirement, after a move, so that we reintroduce ourselves to our public again? Who am I now? And begin to have that kind of conversation. Well, we're moving toward just the last few slides in terms of responding to all that I've given you, in terms of promoting our resiliency as we deal with loss. And so resiliency is the capacity to spring back, to rebound, to spring forward, and embrace. It's the Rumi poem again. I'm taking you back to the first poem. How do we welcome and entertain all of it? How do we get our team together to be with us around this? And Ann Maston from the University of Minnesota says resilience arises out of ordinary resources and processes. It's the ability to ask for help. It's the ability to know who's on your team. I do a caregiver group, and an elder care lawyer comes, and she says, "If you don't know who's on your team, you're in trouble." And the group says, "What do you mean? I don't know what you mean by a team." She says, "If the person who died was your financial manager and you're not good at that, you need to get someone to help you with your finances. If the person who died was the cook and you don't know how to cook, you either need to get Meals on Wheels, or you need to begin to learn how to cook, or or you begin to cook together with some others. Who's your fix-it person?" So all of those kind of ordinary resources. An example even there, I walked out of a care facility one evening with a woman whose husband was dying of a brain tumor. And I asked her as I was going out, the two of us were going out together, I said, "Is there any other way I can be helpful? I've sat with you tonight and before. I'm willing to do it again." And then she surprised me and said, "Ted, would you mind cleaning up my house?" Well, I hadn't expected that. That was never one, no one's ever asked me to do that. And I told her so. And I said, well, I'm willing to entertain that, but say more. And what a piece of wisdom she gave me about resilience. She said, Ted, it's so hard to be here in this place of death and dying every day and then go home to a dirty house. I just don't have the energy to clean it anymore. So you know what I did? I cleaned her house.
Because the system does not meet minimum requirements.
Yep.
Things are moving. Yep.
Okay, so it's the ability to connect and reconnect, avoiding disconnection as we began to move toward our coping with something. So a piece that's important in terms of differences between depression and grief has to do with also the issue of can we have joy in our lives? Because depression and grief contain sorrow that can be ongoing. Both contain elements of depressive emotions, the sadness that I mentioned earlier. But the key difference is the ability to grow life, even experience joy and fullness regularly, while also grieving. Listen to this. If you don't remember anything else today, I think this is important from Nell Noddings. Joy as a seemingly real quality in our lives can occur even in pain and periods of deep grief. It does not seem to be the case that joy and grief can occur simultaneously, but they can occur alternately. That is, the pervasive emotion may be grief, and yet joy can slip in momentarily. So it may happen that even in the deepest grief, sorrow and regret and despair, I may still see and feel joy there in the world trembling at my fingertips. Here's a story, an actual story from Barbara Kingsolver. In my own worst seasons, I've come back from the colorless world of despair by forcing myself to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing. Some glorious flowers outside my bedroom window, or my daughter in a yellow dress, or the perfect outline of the full dark sphere behind the crescent moon, who has no thought of grief, until I've learned to be in my life, in love with my life again. The direction in which we look will determine what we see. Are we open to look for joy? And so on. And then she goes further, like a stroke survivor, reteaching the brain and certain parts of the body to work together again. I've had to teach myself joy over and over again. That it doesn't just happen, but I have to reach for it and grasp it. So just a few more. Here's an image. The top jars that there at the top, you see that stone in the jar that's dominating. That often happens at the time of onset or at the death, at the time of assessment or a diagnosis, and it's the dominating narrative. But we somehow learn to live with it, and it's still there even 3 years, 10 years later, and still is part of our story, but we've learned to adapt. It's like a father who is feeding his child by a feeding tube, and a friend said, how do you do that? He said, if I thought about it too much, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. It's just the way I feed my child. So that's the adaptation. And so that can be wonderful. But I want you also to pay attention to the one at the bottom because it relates to the joy story I just shared. Look at the stones there. It's just as big in year 1 as in year 3, as in year 10. So it's what we might call a chronic sorrow. Some medical or mental health conditions that aren't going to get better, or there's not going to be a resurrection of your loved one, or there are certain kinds of conditions that just will go on. But look what happened to the jars. It's the ability to grow life, experience joy and fullness, while also even living with what we might call a chronic sorrow. Here's another way of looking at that, is this dual process of moving from a loss orientation at times, doing the grieving work that I've talked about at length here this morning, but also the ability to oscillate to the other side of restoration, to respite, attending to life changes, doing new things, to have distraction, new roles, new identities, and the ability to move back and forth between these two, and the importance of that. If you're doing that, you begin to name your losses, you begin to grieve the losses, you begin to put the loss in perspective, you reinforce your support connections, friends and neighbors, asking people for help. You set limits, say no to some things so you can say yes to others. You have a healing plan. Is it Mother Nature? Is it music? Is it your own faith? What are some of the components? I want us to talk about that in just a moment. And then we're going to talk about finding joy and promoting hope and even rituals for grieving and healing. So hope has to do with expectation.
Customize your view.
Can I ask you to mute your computer, if you will, for just a moment? We're almost ready for discussion.
Yep, I got it. Sorry.
Okay, just 2 more slides in terms of hope in the midst of the grieving. If you look up in the dictionaries and the thesauruses, what do we mean by hope? It has to do with expectation and desire. So here's where our brain comes in. It may help us with goal setting, looking at our attributes, both that we possess, but also things that others can do for us, like cleaning the house. How do we redefine ourselves? I've had to do that over the last year. My wife of 41 years died suddenly, unexpectedly, late July last year. And so now I'm a widower. So now I'm alone, though she's still with me. So it's all that redefinition. How do I reintroduce myself even to myself? Find meaning and peace and energy. So here are some particular bullets that I think can be useful for that. And I want you to think about what you might draw on for yourself. But these are ones I want us to discuss. Bob Vaninga says that reasonable hope is relational. Those people who have some people in their corner do better than others when facing a tragedy. So who's there for you? Who can you turn to? Reasonable hope is a practice. We don't leave it to good intentions, but we set goals. There you see it also in the fourth. You put it on the calendar. A woman in the caregiver group that I do knows that if she doesn't go swimming at least once a week, she's not going to be good for her care receiver. So she knows that she needs to do that body care, needs to just get into the pool one more time and move herself around. There's the ambiguity in the middle. Reasonable hope maintains the future is open, uncertain, and influenceable. How do I begin to live with ambiguity? I can influence it. The health departments have told us during the pandemic, because of so much ambiguity, that we need to have some anchors of stability. Try to maintain the same sleep pattern, 3 good meals a day, do your exercise, do your body care, make the phone calls at certain times so that you have stability in the midst of ambiguity. And then the last one that has to do with accommodates doubts and contradictions and despair, that we can begin to even embrace those. It's that oscillation model between the restoration and the grieving. So my final question for you before I move away from the slides and we have some discussion is there a particular thing that you draw on to help you at moments of grief? William Stafford calls it a thread. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about your thread. It's hard for others to see. While you hold it, it can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. You suffer. You get old. Nothing you can do will stop time's unfolding, but you don't ever let go of your thread. So as I asked earlier, is your thread music? Is it Mother Nature? Wendell Berry says if he wakes in the middle of the night and worried about the state of the world, he goes into the peace of wild things and lays down where the wood rake lays, and he gets better because of being in Mother Nature. Is it exercise? Is it faith? Is it some aphorisms from the past, some scripture, some sayings that keep you going? What is it that helps you with whatever might come? Well, let's practice a moment of body care before I move away from the slides. Would you take a deep breath? Let's have a moment just to pause. I'm going to move away from the slides and so that you can begin to ask me or Lisa put some things in the chat so that we can have a conversation with one another.
Yes. Gosh, Ted, that was so much to take in and to consider and to think about. And so at this time, I know there were some questions in the chat box and there were some comments as well. So I'm going to let Angela first ask the questions from the chat box. So Angela, I'll let you go through those first. We'll have some discussion around those things. And then if people have other questions or want to chat, they can put it in the chat box or unmute themselves. But we're going to start with what was in the chat box already. So Angela, go ahead and what were some of those questions and comments?
Yeah. So what are practical tips for choosing joy during grieving? Is it forcing emotion to develop the habit of choosing joy? Is this like the power of positive thinking?
There can be that kind of voluntary piece that you do where you know some things that has some efficacy for you, and so it's a bit of that positive thinking. But it's also what I said as I move through the slides, the direction in which you look will determine what you see. And so do you expose yourself, for example, instead of starting with the first page of the newspaper, for example, or if you do it online, do you go to the cartoons first? Do you look for things that, do you have friends who have an ability to simply tell a good joke and bring you to some laughter? Are there particular songs that cause your body to move in a more joyful way than they would if it was a lament or an elegy? So yes, so it's partly knowing yourself and some of the things that might aid you in moving across the threshold from grief to joy through that oscillation process. But I'm also urging you to be surprised. Remember Barbara Kingsolver, she said, all I have to do is look outside in springtime and I see all these gardens with lovely flowers and the colors, they just embrace me. Again, the difference for some people between depression and grief is, do you open the blinds? Do you open the curtains and let the sunshine in? So simply to do that. I know some people, a very practical thing that they do if they're living with chronic pain is that before they go to bed at night, they put a fresh a set of clothes on the chair that's there for them as soon as they wake up in the next morning. Because if that's there, it's telling them to go ahead and get up. Whereas if they allow the pain to take over, the suffering to take over, they may pull up the covers and just stay in bed. So it's both some of these overt acts as well as things that are surprises for us.
Thank you. Can you explain disenfranchised losses in a little more depth? Do you have an example to share to help me understand?
Okay, and it's elaborating part of what I said to try to make it as clear and simple as possible, but it's when you have a circle of people that disenfranchise your grieving, that they are not willing to honor it. What's the common example here in Minnesota? If I ask you, how are you? There are only two acceptable responses. Okay, fine, doing all right. Yeah, that's okay. Well, that can be a kind of disenfranchisement. And what if you're the one asking in that case, the comeback that I think we need to have is, really? Tell me more. Tell me what's different now than it was 3 months ago, that we get them, as Lisa was saying, to elaborate and expand. As I said earlier, what I mean by that is that some friends and others try, and it comes out of a good intention, that if we're grieving, they want to do something that lightens the load, lifts the burden, makes things a bit better. And it's what I call Minnesota Cheer Up. And while it's a lovely gesture, I want them to sit with me on my mourning bench, on my grieving bench. So that's disenfranchisement. If someone is moving too quickly for you on Cheer Up, say, yes, there are times when I need cheer up, and I'm glad to know that you're willing to help me with that, but I'm having a hard day today. Would you just hang in with me right now? I can use your presence. And it may be that we do it that way to move away from the disenfranchisement. One final example is some families, especially around family gatherings that don't happen frequently, don't want there to be conversations about some of the hard stuff. Let's not talk about grandma, because this is the only time we get together, and her death 2 years ago. Well, there may be people who want to talk about grandpa, so let those people gather at 2 o'clock, share some memories of grandma, and the others arrive at 3:30 and have a party. So you can do both. It's not one size fits all, but try to find ways to overcome the disenfranchisement. Next one.
When COVID-19 is not part of the four-legged stool, does it become a three-legged stool, or does another crisis take the place of COVID to become the four-legged stool?
Oh, oh gosh, that's a wonderful question. I hope it's only a three-legged stool. Maybe we'll get back to a two-legged stool where it's the shattered dreams and the personal losses. Yes, there may be another tragedy. That was simply my image for the last, 2 years or so. So create your own metaphor. But and for any one of us, one of those might be quite dominant, so that we're hardly even aware of the state of the world or the pandemic because we're doing 24/7 caregiving. And so it's at the top there, and the shattered dream that goes with that. So yes, create your own metaphor, but let's hope we don't get overload of too many things calling for our attention.
And this one was a comment, not necessarily a question. The comment was, some handle grief better than stress.
Yeah, and so that's the self-awareness piece that I've mentioned a few times. Know yourself and know what attributes, what qualities you have for dealing with some things. So some people with stress in particular, it's the old adage that when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And they began to marshal their resources in dealing with whatever is the stress. Well, they may not have the same capacity in terms of dealing with grief. And they get a bit flooded in terms of, I'm not good at this. I don't know what to say, or I don't even know what to do. Should we take the Minnesota hot dish? And so that's where we need to know our own discomfort, or where we don't have the particular skill set, and ask some people to help us with that, if that's the part. Some others may be wonderful at grieving, but don't handle stressful, overloaded situations. And so draw on that's where your team or your family, let me even expand family. Pauline Boss says that we need to know that we have two kinds of families. One is the family of no choice. That's the relatives, the nuclear family, the biological family, the legal family, and so on. It can be wonderful. But she says we also need to have a psychological family. And her definition of psychological family are those who are there for you when you need them to be there. That may not be the relatives. That may not be the family, because they all might be grieving or they all might be stressed. And so we need someone else who can be part of our circle, who can clean our house or befriend us in some way because they're not preoccupied with the losses or the stress that we are. It's the reason that some people use counselors and therapists and chaplains and spiritual advisors. It might even be what some people call paid friends to help us through, because we don't have that particular skill set. Or shall we go ahead?
I was just going to make a comment. The 3 areas of how stress shows up. As I was looking at that list of 3 things, I find, I was thinking about myself. I find that, gosh, I find all 3 of those areas.
Sure.
And one thing that I've learned that's been helpful for me is, I don't know if you've ever heard of, have you heard of HALT BS?
Well, I don't think so. Say more.
Well, it's an acronym. It stands for, are you hungry, angry, anxious, lonely, tired, bored, or stressed? And so,
I love it.
yep. So whenever, if I'm feeling a certain way, if I am stressed, it's like, well, okay, well, what's that about? If I'm feeling a certain way, upset about something, having trouble in an area, whether it be relationships, work, whatever it is, I stop and ask myself, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I anxious?
Yes.
Am I lonely? Am I tired, bored, or stressed? And then try to figure that out, and then deal with that. And that's really help with my stress level.
Yeah. And what I love that you're saying, Lisa, is to listen to those early warning signals or early signs that you are stressed. An example that fits with what you just said. A friend of mine said, when stressed, if you get a headache, don't take the aspirin immediately. Rather, ask yourself, where's the stress? What's going on? If you know that that is something that happens to you when you're stressed, uh, what's stressing me right now? And so do a bit of an assessment, then take the aspirin and use your better self now to address the stress. If like you said, if you go to the refrigerator too quickly, and you know that getting comfort food is one of the signs that I'm stressed. Before going to the refrigerator, pause for a moment and say, what's the stress? And maybe then when you open the refrigerator door, you'll get a piece of fruit instead of, some munchies that might not be as good for you. And so to listen to your own body and where the stress might show up first. Thank you for putting that in the chat. I'm going to take that one down. Yeah. Okay.
I use that one a lot.
Okay. Shall we open for someone to unmute and ask a question? We've got about 20 minutes or so still in the session. Glad to hear questions if someone wants to unmute and ask something. And Angela, you can butt in at any time and give us another one from the chat.
Will do. There's no questions in the chat right now.
Okay. So who has a question or even want to share a resource? That I've named a few, but you may have resources that would be beneficial to the rest of us in attendance here today.
I am reading a book right now by Pauline Boss, and she is an excellent author. I don't know if she has other books out, but it's called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, but how to find hope while coping with stress and loss. And just reading her first chapter, it's just so good. And I know she has a website as well, and I can certainly. She has a lot of information on ambiguous loss.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I could certainly share that. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Her earlier writing was scholarly writing. She's now a professor emeritus in family social science at the University of Minnesota. And so her earlier writing was a bit more for professional audiences, but this book that Lisa mentioned is very accessible. And she really is helpful to families that have someone in their circle living with dementia. So it's a wonderful resource.
Kathy asks, how do I understand myself better?
That's probably the lifelong question for a lot of us.
And I didn't finish the question. I'm sorry, I sent it too early, but I guess the question would be, how would I expand my psychological family?
Okay. Okay. Well, even the first part, I've begun as I'm aging and I'm moving through my own life to ask some intimates to give me a description of some of the attributes that they see that I possess. Because some of us at times are unaware of our own strengths, our own attributes, because we are just used to them or take them in stride. And some of the attributes also mean some of the deficits, some things that they see that might need my attention. So to ask for feedback, I've given permission to all my children, my 4 children and my grandchildren, to give me feedback if they see me slipping because of age, if they see me doing some things that they think are a bit dangerous or whatever, that they have full permission to speak to me about it. I'm also asking them for the other side of the attributes that they see, their qualities that I want to sustain. So that part. In terms of the second part, Kathy, it's a lovely question. It may be one to, in terms of the psychological family, it may be in some cases with a set of friends who are family-like for you, to let them know how valuable they are to you. That's so crucial. And it may be if you've only been doing things in a kind of one-dimensional way with certain people, the classic thing for a guy is their hunting buddy, their fishing buddy, their athletic buddy. But that buddy may have additional skill sets, finances, loves cooking, is good, and other aspects to get some people in your circle, friends and family, to expand the ways in which you can connect with them. If there are qualities that you want to access within your present circle, say, do you know anyone who is good at this? I think this is something I need to add. I want to do this better as I get older. So in all of those ways, it may also be as we especially move away from this pandemic and begin to move back into social settings, to make yourself available socially and listen for people who might then be included in that psychological family. One quick example for myself, I mentioned earlier that my wife died in July, and I was a bit haunted somewhere along the way that now the descriptors for me were that I was a widower, or that I was single, or that I'm living a solo life. And all of those were a bit grating to me. I wasn't quite sure. And it's still, I know that I'm getting used to. It's now almost 10 months since my wife died. And someone was so helpful in reframing that. Said, Ted, you've never been single in your life. There's always been a collection of people in your life, and anyone who has a collection of people in their life is part of a collective. You're not single. So it's just a lovely way of letting me know that on those days when I got up and felt particularly kind of alone or isolated or solo or single, that all I had to do was to call the phone, use my phone, walk outside, lots of ways in which I could access parts of my collective. So I would just admonish that one as well.
Ted, just to go back to your one question, when you're talking about what attributes do you possess, but asking what deficits, how do you, because I think if I was to ask like my husband that, or my kids or friends, I wonder if it would be about the things that bug them about me. Is it more about them, or is it really a deficit of mine? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I think so. And yes, we need to do that with some caution because, yes, they can be speaking more about themselves than actually seeing you. But it's getting some feedback. A practical example, again, it relates to my wife's death, of that when she died, because of my car and her car, it was the time to assess the cars. And my grandchildren and my children said, Grandpa, why don't you sell both cars and get yourself a new safe car? And I was kind of taken with their word safe car, partly because I had an old car. It was a 2011, so it didn't have lots of the present features of safety that cars have. And that's really what they were emphasizing. But I did ask them then, say, have you seen in my driving something that seems a bit unsafe? And they were being candid with me, and it wasn't my own driving, but they're aware that now lots of the cars have those backup features, or if you move into another lane, or this or that. And so it just is allowing me, at whatever age I am and whatever my ability set, to relax a bit more in the car and not have to think about things. The car is going to help me a bit more. But I had to check with them to see what they meant by, why does Grandpa need to get a safer car? Was that just their projection, or did they actually have some data, some stories that I needed to hear?
Lita shared, I went to a grieving conference specific to those who ended their life. Important takeaway was to not use the term suicide anymore, but ended one's life. The conference also stressed that we all grieve different and may never stop grieving, and that's okay. I think we expect people to have closure, but after the conference, we don't have to. We can grieve in a healthy way.
Well, yeah, wonderful. Let me speak to both of those. One is, yes, you heard me say during the session, especially as I was getting toward the metaphors, that we need to look at the words that we use and the words that people say, and be as caring as we can with the words. And one of the words even about suicide that people say that we should for sure avoid is someone committed suicide, as is saying by committed that it was always thoughtful. It was always rational. And what we know about suicides is that they can be a mixture of rational and irrational, and some can be dominated and be even under the influence of drugs or alcohol or other kind of chemicals. And it certainly is not something that's rational. And so a word that some people say is, if you're going to use the word suicide, to have completed suicide. I like also what you were hearing in the conference, that some people talk about end of life, ended their life. So it's looking at the word set. So certainly not committed, but completed, or was ending their life. Excuse me. Help me, Angela. What was the second part of that? Oh, I know. It has to do with continuing bonds. The old notion about grief and bereavement was that we were to bury the dead and then move on. But part of what we've learned about grieving is that we carry these associations with us the rest of our lives. And so it's to move the living person to a continuing bond with us as a now dead person. And lots of ways that we do that. I still have a sweater that my dad wore and that it fits me. It has my same size, and it's just a wonderful kind of touchstone and memory object that I can put on. Some people have jewelry, some people have a watch, those kind of touchstones. But it's also values. We're urged as we age to write an ethical spiritual will, and some of the values that we want to pass on from one generation to another. Those are all continuing bonds, and to keep the persons as part of our lives and not just leave those behind because they enrich us. And so there will be times when, if I'm facing a decision, I'll think, oh, what would my dad say? What would mom say? You know, what would my wife advise me to do? And so I began to call their memories into my awareness so that they can inform me and be part of the continuing circle. Are there other
One
questions?
comment, not a question, just a comment, is few counselors trained in DSM for chronic disorganization, a negative term for hoarding.
It's not something I specialize in, but there are people around and resources that are available so that people, the intervention often has to do with safety because the hoarding can lead to a very unsafe environment for the friend, the neighbor, the family member. It's a delicate one because there is something that's going on in terms of their mental health that's caused them to begin to do that. And so it does need some special care. You or Lisa may have resources there in your area that could be useful to people, but I would urge if you perceive that going on, or you yourself or see that tendency in yourself, that you ask for help around it because it does need our attention.
And I think too, she might have been pointing out too, just the importance of the words, how we use our words.
Yes.
And if I could add, I hear, instead of saying dementia patients, that's so negative, using the word living with, because we
Yes.
don't say, diabetes patients or cancer
Right.
patients, So
Yeah.
let's change our words and really be aware of that.
If not multiple things. And so the more that we can say living with, the better.
Right, right.
Barbara shared, my husband died in March and my daughter has made purses for the sister-in-laws and me out of my husband's shirts. It's a neat way to remember him.
Yeah. Even cooking I can never, of course, duplicate in any way mother's cooking, but I try to emulate some of the dishes that she made. I think especially of a potato and onion fried together dish that was just marvelous. And so I'm getting closer to her taste, but still on the way.
Pamela asks, any suggestions for how to respond to a grieving relative who still expresses a lot of anger around the circumstances of the death nearly a year later? Is it best to continue to try to validate those feelings or somehow encourage them to try to let go? If so, how to let go?
A couple responses. A lot of people around, however the death occurred, but especially certain kinds of deaths, they get more focused on how the person died than the reality that they're dead. And so I would urge at least some attention to being attentive to both of those and try to separate the conversation that however someone died, the reality is that they're gone, they're missing, they have died. The grandson that I mentioned, who died in 2017, happened to die of an opioid overdose. That's how he died. And so, yes, our families had to deal with that because he was over a 6-year period not able to move across the threshold from the using life to the sober life, and without at least three treatment programs, lots of interventions, but he never was able to take that bold step across the threshold from the using life to the sober life. So that's how he died. But the reality is, I miss him. So it's that part that's part of it to be important. The other thing that's in the question is that while anger can be legitimate in some cases, especially the way that a death has occurred, often anger is a secondary emotion, or at least is wrapped up with other emotions. Underneath the anger is hurt, is disappointment, is being overloaded, is being scared, being dismissed, not heard, not valued. And so I would urge in this case that they not just listen to the anger, but listen to the feelings and thoughts that are underneath the anger, and invite storytelling. What I mean by storytelling is to take them back in time and see if you can begin to ascertain what began to lead to the anger. And was it hurt or disappointment? Was it a lack of resources? Was it something else? And then to give that some validity that then helps to diffuse the anger. But we're listening to the larger story and not just saying, you can't be angry about that for the rest of your life. Get over it. That's probably not going to do any good. And so it's to listen for the stories that are connected to what might be legitimate anger, or it may simply be a way of coping for some people. It's hard to go to the hurt. It's hard to go to their own guilt. It's hard to go to their own complicity in some ways. And so that's where it may help to have a therapeutic professional help you with that kind of assessment.
This is Nora. Can
Hello?
you hear me?
Go ahead.
Hi. Yes. I just finished taking a course called Safe Community Nursing, and looking at how we have a big chapter on grief and loss and suffering, and to try to reduce someone's suffering, which is the goal of nursing. I can't get rid of it. And you seem to be talking a lot about presence, just somebody being there without offering advice, or to kind of be in that moment, like you say, go to where they are. If someone has Downer syndrome, you don't correct them that their children aren't getting off the bus right now. If you would ask them, what are they wearing, or do they bring you something nice from school today? But how do you, and I understand too that the stages of grief, they used to thought to be linear, right? Now that they're saying, well, no, that's not the case. They come and go, and you never know when you're going to get hit by grief with that. So I guess my question is, it's such a complex thing, grief is, and loss and suffering. If you had to pick like one intervention, and I get that everyone's different and there's so many things, what would you say in your years of experience has been the most helpful to someone undergoing immense grief and suffering? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for asking the question. Yes, if I understand correctly, in the nursing program, or when we're dealing with something that involves a medical intervention, we probably want to differentiate between whatever is the medical or mental health condition, and what kinds of treatments, what kind of medications, what kinds of rehabilitation would be beneficial for addressing those medical issues, from the grief that someone might have because of the medical condition they're living with. And that's where during the presentation, I mentioned that, I mentioned even here in the discussion period, that some people treat our grief as if they can do something to lighten the load, to cheer us up, to make it better. And they move in that direction, what I call the cheer up. And while the intention is lovely, we need to allow people to grieve the implications of a medical condition that may compromise the quality of their life, their mobility, their speech, their health, their pain, whatever, and they're grieving it. And so to honor that grieving, and hopefully the nurses in this case would be part of the training, would be to honor the patients and the clinic, honor the grieving, as well as to provide the best of medical care. And so it's some people use the terms to separate pain from, and use the word suffering to include some of the grieving. That's more psychological, is more spiritual, but it's to honor the grief on the one hand, but also honor the whatever's going on medically or in a mental health way, but give them good attention on both sides.
Ted, have you ever heard of Brene Brown?
Yes, yes,
Yes. She's, I think, another great resource.
yes, yes. And she's normalized a lot of the help seeking that we can do.
Yeah, I will put, when I email everybody the PowerPoint presentation, I will send along some of the links and some information on some of the resources that we've been talking about today. So I will definitely be sharing that as well. So we're kind of getting down to our time, and I guess I just want to say thank you so much, Ted, for being here today, for taking the time and presenting to our group on such a good topic, difficult topic, but just so very good to hear. I just really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody, all the participants did as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me and for the participation today. Lovely to work with you and Angela. Good wishes to everyone. Have a good weekend.
And thank you to everybody else for attending. And if you haven't yet, be sure to register for the next webinar, which is on Friday, June 4th at 10 o'clock. And the topic is going to be assistive technology and assuring connection. And we have Laura Plummer, who is from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, and she will be addressing the use of technology and the different devices. So what's available, how to use, accessibility, and just so much more. Because I don't know about you, but trying to figure out devices and what's out there and how to use technology is a tough one for me. So if you haven't registered, please be sure to go to our website at eauklar-adrc.org and register for that one and any of the other ones as well. So with that said, thank you again for being here today, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you. Bye-bye.